We are going to move into our next panel discussion. I think because we're running behind, we will let people do breaks as you need to voluntarily. So if you need to stand up and stretch or use the restroom or just need to drink, feel free to do so. But we'll go ahead and move in. So I'm going to turn it over to our research subcommittee chair, Bateman, who will lead our next panel discussion. Again, this has been, as we discussed this morning, a chance for us to hear from people who aren't always at the table. So hear from industry, to hear from the healthcare systems, and to integrate and continue this discussion on how do we move the care that we need to the clinical practice based on their new research findings, including things like our discoveries, but not just this. Dr. Bateman.
You want to use it? Or do you want to use it?
Folks online community. All right, I'll get started. I'm going to accelerate my presentation because I want to get to some of the other presentations and including time for discussion at the end of the day so that we can focus on some things. I have mostly good news to share in my presentation because I am sharing the research historical recommendations of progress. As I said earlier, in the research community, we've made incredible progress on multiple fronts. I like what these top-level recommendations over the years for NAPA have been and what our current status is, and then what future recommendations are. Where can we go from here? What is coming next? The next slide. Here's my full disclosures. I'll leave it up just for a minute because my research at the university is supported by a wide range of organizations, including several federal agencies, such as the National Institutes of Health. I have collaborative public-private trials, the DIAN and DIAN-2 trials running internationally. And I also advise pharmaceutical companies and I co-founded a diagnostics company, Centurion Diagnostics, that has a clinically available blood test that was developed based on initially NIH-funded research. And this research has gone forward now to allow us to track the pathology of Alzheimer's disease in the blood. Next slide. The point of my brief presentation will be to highlight some of the overall progress challenges and the opportunities in translating the research advances that we've made. We heard this earlier today from multiple federal agencies, the FDA, CMS, VA, about their plans and their process, how they evaluate the food and provide access and support to new advancements in treatments. This afternoon, we're going to hear from several other groups, including industry, developers of drugs, and also healthcare systems, how its health systems are thinking about the opportunities and challenges and how to deliver treatments to patients. And then the discussion, the idea there is for us to focus on where do we have potential overlap or synergy? Where can we work together to develop these opportunities? How do we tackle some of the challenges that we were talking about earlier? And what are the next steps that we can do to maximize the health impact of patients? Next slide. And so the current landscape of Alzheimer's disease and diagnosis is shown here and summarized. When I was in training, the only way to make diagnosis was after a patient had passed away with the brain autopsy. That's completely changed. We now have PET scans and cerebrospinal fluid tests, I mentioned blood tests, as ways to detect Alzheimer's disease pathology. And the progress in terms of therapeutics is also incredibly promising. There are now 3 drugs that have had positive phase 3 trials showing that removing amyloid plaques to a large degree can have a clinical and cognitive benefit for patients. And that will be reviewed in some of the future presentations this afternoon. The VA has made a coverage decision that we mentioned earlier. The FDA is evaluating the potential for full approval decision for CanMab, and CMS is continuing their decision on how to cover and support treatments, including CanMab and other treatments. Very recently, we had some great news. Donanemab, another amyloid-removing agent, has demonstrated that only removing amyloid plaques leads to clinical and cognitive benefit in patients. So another replication of this hypothesis that started several decades ago, that amyloid plaques were an integral part of the disease, and that by neutralizing or removing them, there may be benefits. I've already mentioned the blood-based biomarkers. There are a couple versions of that are clinically available, but not yet part of any healthcare plan or coverage. Next slide. So the spectrum here, the two polar opposites, and I made them change the arrow, by the way. It was red and blue, and I didn't think that was appropriate in Washington. So we changed the color scheme to more appropriately indicate this is a nonpartisan or bipartisan issue, depending on how you view it. But on the left-hand side is, and I apologize, I can't actually see my slides, so I'm running from memory up here. My old eyes don't get a little bit far away. But on the one side of the spectrum is having a full restriction, not providing access to these drugs. And I think that's where we're at today, right? We have the phase 3 trials finished, the drugs are in the process of being evaluated and being determined by the federal agencies, including the FDA, CMS, VA, and many others. But realistically, patients do not have access to these treatments. I cannot prescribe it, I cannot dose it at my medical center because my health system says we are not going to allow anyone to have it until CMS makes a decision. We don't care if they're self-pay or not. So that's our health system. There are other health systems that are doing similar things out here. And so all of us are on hold. The other end of the spectrum is unrestricted access to treatments and tests, meaning that those that have scientific and medical evidence that they are safe and effective treatments, or that they're accurate as diagnostic tests, are made available to patients who need them to benefit them. And the traditional mode we do this in is the doctor and the patient with the family makes a decision about whether that is going to be beneficial for that individual person based on all the complications of that person's life. How many medications we have, what are the comorbidities, what are the risks of a particular treatment. Ultimately, that is the decision of the physician, the doctor-patient relationship with the individual. But individuals are not always perfect. Not all doctors, not all patients and families make the right decisions. So we have guidelines and guidances. We have policies and regulations and restrictions. And a large part of the goal there is to improve the kind of care that gets delivered to individual patients. But there's a balance. And so somewhere in between complete open access, anyone can do anything they want. I think in our state, I can perform open heart surgery legally. It's not a good idea, and I don't do it. But that's perfectly legal. But it's not safe. And so, but we need some balance there and strike some compromise. And I think that's really the goal that we're all working towards. The agencies are working very hard on this for many years and decades, and making significant advances. And the opportunity to engage with multiple stakeholders is the key part. It's the synergy that happens between the stakeholders that I think will lead to a better, more optimal solution at the end of the day. Next slide. And so, what are the factors that could influence this decision making? In this case, drug access and other medical considerations. Those are shown here, and I don't want to belabor it because we've already been talking about a lot of these things, and this has been presented earlier. But I just want to take a look at the top level bullet points here. The one we haven't covered just yet, but we will, is our capacity of our medical systems. So providing access is part of the solution to the path to health impact. But beyond that, we have to actually be able to do it. We have to physically be able to do this. And that's one of the challenges that we're facing, and we'll hear more about this slide. So here's my summary of NAPA research, the subcommittee historical recommendations in the past 10 years. I'm going to step through each of these. If the person controlling the slides can be ready to go, quick. want to hit the main points. Here we go. Those questions. So, developing a scientific roadmap. Over the past 10 years, the national plan was called on to provide a roadmap, to provide a robust, comprehensive, collaborative, and transformative scientific roadmap to achieve the goal of preventing, effectively treating, and providing effective care and treatment and services by 2025. Well, it's mid-2023, so we are right at that. And this is the charge of now. And we are on our way there. We are making real progress. And this recommendation, though, continues to be relevant because as we learn more, as we get more capable, that roadmap changes. So the roadmap of 10 years ago is not the same roadmap of today. So we'll continue these recommendations and ask everybody to talk about what's coming next and how we'll do this. But I do believe that it's possible for us to have this positive health impact for Alzheimer's patients by 2025. But it will require a lot of work and a lot of very rapid action. Increased research funding. Dr. Otis reviewed this morning the status of research of the National Institutes of Health and other agencies have also been supported in this Alzheimer's effort. And this continues to be one of our top recommendations in research because as far as we've gone, there's still a lot more to go. Slowing the disease down by 30%, 25 to 35% is great. That's something we can never do before. But it's not 100%. So we want to keep going, build on that success, and move it forward so that we can have a greater impact. And so we'll continue this recommendation because there are real scientific opportunities, things that we can do that will have a transformative effect in a few years or 10 years from now and beyond. Next slide. Standardization of terminologies. This has been I think, a largely successful effort over the past, since its initial proposition in 2016. And we continue to evolve the terminology. What is the disease? How do we refer to people with the different diseases? And what does it mean? And appropriately, the terminology is really quite key. How we see the disease and how we react to it, and it's how we study it. And it's what we do in terms of our clinical studies and research studies. So this continues to evolve, and it will, but I think in large part this has been successful. Next slide. Enhancement of recruitment efforts, representation, and health equity. This was first proposed by the subcommittee in 2017. And I think very real progress has been made. Some of that was reviewed just earlier. We reviewed some of the things that are happening. And it's happening in a major way. It's happening at the kind of front end of this research pipeline. It's happening at the level of clinical care and delivery. But just like the research, we have a long way to go. It's still not finished. There's still much to be done here. And we need to think about things as we make decisions about how we allow access to tests and treatments. What impact does that have on things like equity? Does that mean everyone has the same access? Or will it bias certain populations more than others? Will people who are fluent and educated and have access to academic medical research centers get much better care and more appropriate treatment than people who are not? These are the questions that we have to address as we move to the next slide. The infrastructure for sharing research, data, and samples. It's hard for me to believe this started, it must have started in 2018, maybe just in our subcommittee, because the NIH has been doing this for decades. And to me, it's reached an ideal peak. This has been a great success where clinical studies, trials, research centers, data depositions, sharing of data, collaborations, hundreds of groups using the same data set to find out different things has become the norm and the standard in the research field. So I think these things are happening very well, and there's new policies that continue to be enacted to reinforce this. And like most things, of course, it can be improved on, but I think we're pretty much hitting that in the next slide. Engagement of the AD and the ADRD research community as a standard practice in both participating and the setting national research priorities about all stages of clinical research care, services, and support research. In some ways, that's what this is. And many other venues have been enabled so that people can interact, engage, provide comments, discussions, and ask open and hard questions in an open and public way that allows people to hear and see what are our considerations, how are we thinking about this. This level of transparency and engagement is essential to success. None of us will be successful if an individual stakeholder or group of people producing. We need to work together on this. And as it shows here, the NIH has their summary, with certainly with the summits and multiple other meetings that engage us. And I'm looking towards even all of the agencies taking this general approach of one of engagement and to follow this recommendation in the scenario to really engage multiple stakeholders to try to solve these problems the best way we can. Next slide. Early detection of Alzheimer's disease. I think over time, this has meant different things to different groups, and it's evolved. Early detection meaning identifying people with symptoms. So that half, 1 out of 2 people who are undiagnosed who have Alzheimer's disease and or related dementias. And I think it's also become the biological side. Can we pick up the biology of the advent of thinking about the disease as a biological entity? This is morphed into can we use diagnostic tests to detect the disease early, and by early we mean at a stage where we can begin to do something about it, right? More effect the earlier we go. We have less and less opportunity to benefit patients the later in the day. Next slide. And okay. Increase research into care implementation, improving quality of life. This is an area where now I think this is going to gain great attention because this is all we're talking about. Now we can do things to intervene beyond the things we have been doing for the past several decades. We now can begin to do it. And so we want to think about how to implement this, how to engage the implementation sides of research to deliver on the promise of the 2025 goals. Next slide. And finally, this is the 2022, our subcommittee research recommendations. I'm not going to go through each one of these, but I just want to highlight the top number 1. So the committee ranked this number 1 based on the timing of where we're at in scientific development and research. And today's full-day session and discussion points, I think, are a highlight addressing that number 1 recommendation, is that for all of us to focus on the national plan, our goals, and translating over our research and clinical health impact in a way that impacts positively patient care. Next slide. And so to increase these synergies, using evidence-based advancements and improved diagnostic treatment and care paradigms, the 3 things that we talked about this week, to improve the health outcome. This is number 1 recommendation shown here, and as I said, we'll have some discussion at the end of today and then beyond. Next slide. Okay, I'm finished. And now Dr. Ron Peterson will kick off, and he's going to review the past 10 to 11 years of overall NAPA goals and research, and with the title of Have We Made Research Progress?
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Randy. I appreciate the invitation that you and Cindy have afforded me to come back. And it's good to see some of the old friends again back on the advisory council. So Randy has asked me to sort of give a whirlwind tour here of where we've been in the last 10 years or so and focus on diagnostic issues, but also then end up with where we are from a treatment perspective, since that's been much of the discussion thus far. So on the next slide, Helen. Here are my disclosures. On the left side, I do some work with pharmaceutical companies, and NIH funding is outlined on the right for most of our research. And the next click, Helen. This particular study is the Alzheimer's Clinical Trials Consortium funded by the National Institute on Aging, and I'm one of the co-principal investigators on that study. And because that involves public-private partnerships, I'm precluded from doing anything meaningful in a financial sense from the left-hand companies. So what I usually say at this point is that I'm still driving a Yugo. So next slide, Helen, please. So here's where I'd like to go briefly, and I know we got to catch up a little bit, so I won't dwell too much on some of the issues that have already been discussed this afternoon. Next one. And the one after that, Ellen. I have a lot of bills. Here are the goals that Randy has just outlined, and where no, you can go ahead and go there. I'm just going to focus on the prevent and effectively treat AD and ADRD by 2025. And this is just to remind us that in the plan, AD refers to the collection of ADRD disorders. And as Helen may remember, back 10 plus years ago, she and Don Molds and I kind of came up with this terminology to try to capture what was in the law. And for better or worse, these are the descriptors that we've ended on. But when I say AD, I'm going to be primarily referring to Alzheimer's disease specifically, but we realize that this exists in a broader setting of a variety of other neurodegenerative disorders. Next slide. So, and you can click 3 times here, I think, Helen. So Alzheimer's disease, certainly when I was training and probably when many of you were training back in 1984, Alzheimer's disease was a clinical pathologic diagnosis, meaning people had the clinical features of memory problems affecting my function. We did a bunch of rule-out stuff, didn't find anything, and so we ruled it must be probable Alzheimer's disease. Couldn't say definite until the person had an autopsy and we saw plaques and tangles in the brain. Many years later, NIA, Alzheimer's Association, convened some groups to say, gee, haven't we learned something about this disease over the years such that we can incorporate biomarkers? And in fact, back in 2011, then, criteria for preclinical, meaning they don't have clinical features yet, but they have some of the biologic characteristics of Alzheimer's disease, mild cognitive impairment, and dementia stages. And then next click, Helen. In 2018, another group was convened to look at it a little bit more closely, and this group came to the conclusion that maybe we should define Alzheimer's disease biologically on the basis of plaques and tangles in the brain. Plaques made of the protein amyloid and the tangles made of the protein called tau. So this was a major transformation. It's a research proposal. It's not out there yet in clinical practice. But the design was, the effort here was to make clinical trials more specific. By defining the disease biologically, now we can design therapies that go at those targets in the brain. And the next slide. So with this formulation, then Alzheimer's disease was defined by the presence of amyloid and tau in the brain, irrespective of what the clinical presentation could be. Normal, could be MCI, could be dementia. This is a major shift in thinking because we've always thought of it as a clinical pathologic alignment, but now I think we're thinking more biologically, and perhaps with some of the successes we've seen recently in drug therapy, this is paying off. Next one, please. So let me move on then to the AD therapies. We've covered this already somewhat today, but let me go through some of these things briefly. Next one. So for over the years, we've had 2 classes of drugs. For many, many years, it was just the symptomatic therapies, which help. We use them in our patients, but they really don't get at the underlying disease process. But more recently, disease-modifying therapies have come to the fore. Next one. Again. So amyloid is the primary focus right now. Not that there aren't other targets, not that tau isn't a target, inflammation, reactive oxygen species, and the like, but amyloid has received a great deal of attention recently. So next one. The 3 drugs then that have received some coverage recently because they've shown to be effective at reducing amyloid levels in the brain have been aducanumab, lecanemab, and as of last week, donanemab as well as phase 3 trials. Next one. So one slide here on the aducanumab data from the positive study, the eMERGE trial, showing that, in fact, the high dose of the drug did meet its primary outcome of reducing the rate of progression of the disease relative to the placebo group. In the next slide. Here's what this looks like graphically. So this was a big move, and I think it was very important that we realize now that we can actually have an impact on this underlying disease process, and there was a clinical manifestation of the removal of the amyloid. Next one. So where are we with aducanumab? One positive phase 3 trial, one negative, and then a suggestive third trial. So this led to accelerated approval that Dr. Baracchio had outlined earlier today. Next one. More recently, of course, the lecanemab trial was announced in November of last year, I guess it was, the Clarity AD trial. Next slide. And this is the paper, I think, to which Dr. Pike was referring that has been published since the NCD. And so the question becomes, are these data now going to alter what CMS may do with regard to coverage going forward? Next one. So here's the I won't go into details, but basically 1,795 participants in this study randomized to either lecanemab 10 milligrams per kilogram biweekly or to placebo, and were followed for 18 months. Next slide. Primary outcome measure, again, was this change in the CDR sum of the boxes, which is a combination of a clinical and functional endpoint. And then there were 4 secondary endpoints, amyloid level and several other cognitive scales and functional scales with regard to the measurements. Next one. And here's the primary outcome here on the CDR sum of the boxes. And you could see nice separations of the two groups out at 18 months, actually began as early as back at 6 months. So this was pretty confirmatory evidence that apparently removing amyloid at the plaque stage will have a clinical impact on the participants. Next one. And here's a rather dramatic picture of the amount of amyloid removed. So in the bottom curve there, we see that while everybody started out at the same point with regard to the beginning of the treatment trial, by 18 months, those who had taken lecanemab had a significant reduction in their amyloid levels, which then presumably produced the clinical benefit that was demonstrated on the previous slide. Next one. Next one, Helen. There we are. Thank you. Up, back one if you can. So on the previous slide, there were side effects, and these are ARIA amyloid-related imaging abnormalities, either in the form of edema or hemorrhage, and they were elevated in the lecanemab group relative to the placebo group. So these drugs are not to be taken lightly. There are significant side effects that can be monitored and need to be taken into account when they will be used. Next one. As was discussed a little bit earlier, there are some quality of life measures. So there's some subjective improvements here as well. So the top 2 panels indicate that the participants in the study actually felt, again in a blinded fashion, felt that they were improving, and even the proxies, the study partners, realized that perhaps these drugs did in fact have a positive impact on individuals' quality of life. So I think these subjective measures are coming to the fore, that these may actually have meaning for the participants and their families. Next one. So, summary then, the Clarity AD, the lecanemab trial, used almost 1,800 participants, MCI, mild dementia, stage of Alzheimer's disease, 18-month study, 27% slowing, which resulted in about a 0.45 sum of the box change on the CDR sum of the boxes. The secondary measures were all positive, and as outlined on the bottom, there are side effects, ARIA-E and ARIA-H. But generally, very positive results for the field, implying that we can do something about this disease. Next slide. And just last week, we heard the Trailblazer ALZ-2 study from Lilly on their drug donanemab. And again, 1,700 plus individuals with MCI or mild dementia, 18-month study. Interestingly, they stratified their participants on the basis of their tau level as detected by PET. And they showed a 40% slowing of progression in the group that had intermediate tau levels and a 23% slowing when you combine the intermediate and high levels together. The secondary measures were also positive as well. And 72% of the participants returned to negative amyloid levels at 18 months, meaning that almost 3/4 of them then who received the treatment had a reduction in amyloid to a significant level, basically threshold, and there was the clinical accompaniment of that. They too had the ARIA-E and ARIA-H side effects, as has been seen with all drugs in this class. So this is further evidence that we're on the right track here with regard to having effective treatments at disease modification. Next one. So here's a slide that I've stolen from Dr. Yaning Wang, formerly at the FDA for some 18 years, because there's been concern in the field that, well, we've had these amyloid drugs for years and years and years, and most of them have been negative. So what's going on here? So what he's plotted here is on the y-axis, improvement relative treatment to placebo, with going down as being a positive improvement. On the x-axis here, he's plotted amyloid removal. Going to the left is a positive result. So in the next click, Helen, here are a bunch of the studies that were done years ago that were negative for a variety of reasons, whether they're BACE inhibitors or inadequate removal of amyloid or didn't do what they were supposed to do. And they kind of all hover around the 0-0 interaction with regard to clinical improvement and amyloid removal. The next click will show you, though, the more recent studies that have come out now. Certainly a variety of studies that have the effect of removing amyloid from the brain. And if you do the next click, I think you can see that if you take away those negative studies, you really have the impression that to the extent we can remove the amyloid plaque level in the brain, we will get clinical improvement. Down to the left is the best. And I think the next click then will highlight just the Clarity AD, the lecanemab study as fitting in there, and soon we will put the donanemab study on this plot as well. So this gives us the feeling then that we're certainly moving in the right direction with regard to understanding and doing something about the underlying biology of the disease. Next one. So what are the expectations, though? And this is something I think that we need to all step back and take a look at. How much can we expect from these drugs? Next slide. So what are reasonable expectations when we intervene with a single therapy aimed at one of the biological elements of this disease? Next one. So a couple months ago, a group of us put a paper together looking at the idea of what should we expect from these drugs and what is clinically meaningful to the participants. So, yeah, go ahead. In fact, you can. This has got a bunch of builds. Alan, just click through. Keep going. You can keep going. Keep going. There we go. Thank you. Oh, sorry, I had you go too far. So really what we're talking about here is the temporal evolution of the underlying pathophysiology. By that we mean we think that the amyloid protein gets misprocessed and laid down in the brain over years, maybe decades. And now we're trying to impact this process over the course of 18 months. And so really we need to look at this from the perspective of if we make some indentation on this process over the course of 18 months, what does that mean for the future? And really, what does it mean for a clinical benefit? And of course, we have to keep in mind, we're only acting on one element in a very complex process. Amyloid, very important, but not the end of the game. So now we can go to the next one. So here's what we're looking at. We're plotting here. This is hypothetical, but the impact of these drugs. So the blue dotted line is the untreated placebo group. We intervene with the red dotted line there with the therapy. And in the yellow box, we have the 18 months of a clinical trial. we're making an impact on the disease process, but we're hoping that as we go out further in time, this difference between the treated group and the placebo group will increase. We don't know this. This is hypothetical at this point in time, but I think for a period of time, this is likely a reasonable expectation. And the next one sort of puts this into a perspective of what does this really mean? If we preserve function, what does it mean? And what this slide is meant to depict is the fact that in an 18-month trial, if we're able to slow down the rate of progression on this CDR sum of the boxes by about 0.5, we in fact might be preserving function for that individual for about 4.5 months. If we do a 24-month trial, it might be 6 months. So the way we talk to patients with regard to discussing what this drug intervention might mean for you as a patient is whatever level you're at right now, if we can keep you there for 4.5, 6, 8, 10 months, is that important to you? And most patients would say yes. I think at the MCI level of the disease, it's bothering my memory, it's a little inconvenient, but I'm still functioning, I'm still driving. And if you can keep me here for a longer period of time, I think that's clinically meaningful to me. At least this is the argument that's being put forth to try to discuss the implication of these disease-modifying therapies. Next one. Let me just transition to one notion, though, that we've discussed already at the meeting and will maybe be a discussion later on. Well, cost is not the big deal here. It is important. And so consequently, we have a study that we're doing at the Mayo Clinic up in Minnesota where we're looking at the entire population, the people who live here, and we do a random sample of people across the spectrum, ages 30 to 90, and we follow them longitudinally. We do biomarkers, imaging, blood, CSF, DNA on many, many of the individuals. So we decided to ask ourselves, since we have this collection of individuals, they're all patients here, so we have their medical records as well, with their permission, of course, and we asked the question, how many people might be eligible for these disease-modifying therapies in the general population? And the next slide, I won't bore you to tears with this kind of a thing, but we started out with about 5,000 people who were eligible for the study, and then we asked how many of them had had MRI scans, how many have had PET scans, and how many of them had had positive PET scans for amyloid, and of those with positive PET scans for amyloid, how many of them have the diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment or mild dementia? In the next slide. So after we then winnow it down to a group, then we asked how many might we exclude now because of, as Sherry was talking about earlier, the medical comorbidities that these, so I'm not going to treat this person if the person also has concomitant cancer or is dealing with COPD or other chronic health condition. So we looked through and tried to see how many of these individuals we would actually end up treating if they have a positive PET scan, they have the diagnosis of MCI or mild dementia. And in the next slide, I think we came up with a somewhat smaller percentage than we would think might be the case. Next one, Helen. Turns out that there was only about 8 to 17% of the population would be eligible. That is, if you call them down. Now, this is extremely conservative, and I'm not sure this would apply everywhere. But I think the point is that it's many fewer people. It's not millions and millions of people who might be eligible for these drugs, especially if you apply the inclusion-exclusion criteria of the phase 3 clinical trials. The population is considerably smaller. So while some people are screaming from the rooftop saying it's going to bankrupt the system, I'm not sure that's the case if, in fact, we apply the criteria that were used in the clinical trials for these individuals. Next one. So let me finish up then by saying, have we achieved some progress over the years? And next slide. We've made progress. Next one. So I'd like to thank Dr. Amy Kelly from the NIA, and I think Dr. Hodis has probably gone over these. She shared these with us last week at an Alzheimer's Center Directors meeting, and Dr. Hodis knows these well. Over the 10 years, considerable activity has taken place with regard to treatment of AD and ADRD disorders. 459 clinical trials currently underway, pharmacologic, non-pharmacologic, caregiving, neuropsychiatric symptoms, diagnostic tools. In the next one, we can see that there's the pharmacologic trials on the left, a variety of mechanisms. While we've been focusing on amyloid recently, there are a whole host of other targets being looked at on the non-pharmacologic side as well. 152 trials are looking at a variety of things that we can do for ourselves, perhaps in addition to the pharmacologic approach, to have an ultimate outcome. And then the next slide gets into dementia and caregiving, and that on the caregiving side, a number of clinical trials have evolved. And I must say this has happened largely during the NAPA era in the last 10 years, that with the summits that have been held on dementia and caregiving, that it's come to the realization that we can do a lot on this side of the ledger as well. So next slide. I think I'm finishing up here. So are we there? Helen, click the next first one. I think that amyloid now, as defined as one of the defining features of the disease, is identifiable. We can measure it in the next one. Helen, you can click down about 3 or 4 here and we'll get some of these. So 3 monoclonal antibody trials positive for lowering amyloid. The effects are consistent and I think clinically meaningful. FDA has given accelerated approval to 2 of the drugs. Full approval is pending. And then the donanemab data will be under consideration sooner than later. Next one. CMS is deciding on coverage, as we discussed, and we'll discuss a little bit later. Next one. So where we were in 2011, I think we've come a long way. And is NAPA responsible? I think NAPA certainly contributed to it. Certainly the increased funding in the research vein has been very impactful with regard to the development of criteria, diagnostic techniques, and therapies. Next one. But we're not there by any means. And we certainly have a lot of work to do. And I think there's one more here, Helen. That dementia, more broadly defined with the ADRDs, is still a worldwide problem with significant number of people. And while we're focusing on some aspects of a very important aspect of all defined dementia, I think that we're also making progress in the other areas as well. I think I have one more slide then, Helen, or maybe 1 or 2. Yeah. So these may be issues for discussion later. They've come up already during the meeting. Who should administer these therapies initially? I was very impressed by the VA insofar as they have taken this notion that maybe specialists at first until we learn about these drugs. Randy talked about the screening issues. Should we be using blood, PET, CSF, et cetera? And then, as we were discussing earlier already at the meeting, implications of CED for coverage. My concern is that the more restrictions, even light touch restrictions, that are placed on the utilization of these drugs might actually increase disparity and will make individuals from underrepresented group less likely to get these therapies than if there were fewer restrictions. Now, again, this is a personal interpretation of this, but I am concerned that the more bureaucracy that's required for the utilization and payment and coverage of these drugs will actually increase the disparity, because people who are providing care for underrepresented groups may not have access to, may not have the time, the ability to do the bureaucracy that would be required with the registry. But this is certainly a topic for discussion later on. And I think that's it, Helen. One more there. But I want to thank the group again for the opportunity to at least share some thoughts. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ron. Really appreciate the very nice overview. We're gonna keep steamrolling ahead because we're trying to catch up on time. And our next speaker is a representative from Eisai, a company that has a FDA accelerated approval agent, lecanemab. And Amir Tahami is a physician scientist and epidemiologist. He's going to present today on his company's plan for how to address the challenges and the opportunities to deliver on health impact. And he's joined by his colleague at Biogen, Maha Radhakrishnan, who is deep experience across medical fields, cardiovascular, diabetes, multiple sclerosis, and more recently the ALS kit. So we've asked our industry stakeholders to come to this meeting and help us think about what are the challenges in terms of being able to not just develop treatments, but to deliver them to the patient population.
Thank you, Dr. Beckman, and thank you for the opportunity. And we have actually the slide, just because I cannot actually see this far, it's brought your mic up here.
Oh, you can.
Yes,
Okay. Oh, you can just come in next slide.
May I have the next slide, please? This is my disclosure. I just wanted to make sure that you understand that I'm actually an employee inside, and also we're talking about some of the information that was presented by the physician actually just now on the campus. Next slide, please. Next. I just wanted to actually provide you with a just broad overview of what is happening with generative disorders like Alzheimer. Alzheimer, as we know, is the most common form of dementia that we have. And also, one of the key factors that I just wanted to raise here is that it's actually a very deadly disease as well, because as the disease progresses over time, we're going to have actually some unfortunately increased mortality that is happening in these patients. And that is something that it is not actually often discussed, and that is the most basically one of the leading cause of death in the US and also across the globe. Next slide. The global socioeconomic cost of Alzheimer is actually tremendous, and that is going to be beyond just the basically medical and non-medical cost of treatment, which is actually referred to as direct cost. But also the indirect cost of treatment is tremendously high. And also when it comes to some of these patients that they require actual caregiving, that cost is going to be tremendously high as well. And that is going to have a huge burden on the not only actually on patients and family, but also on the society overall. Next slide, please. The burden of Alzheimer actually is increasing by disease severity, but as actually was presented in this publication recently, it's just the tip of the iceberg, because what we actually see is just what we pay, and that is not really exactly what we pay for the Alzheimer's, because when you're looking at the indirect cost, specifically for productivity loss and also some of these actually other impact on the society, that is going to be tremendously higher than actually what we anticipated. And that is really well documented. And this is not even including some of the costs that are associated with the treatment and suffering of patients and caregivers. Next slide, please. I thought that we can actually use the clinical pathway to really identify some of the opportunities that we have in terms of some of the processes of care, and also identify the gaps and opportunities within the care pathway. Next slide, please. This is actually what we have in terms of the opportunities along the clinical process. And when you're looking at this one, actually, this would be basically from early on, that is looking at the disease, and as well as actually some of the information that is related to the epidemiology of the disease, but also is going to be looking at everything from early detection all the way to actual management of patients and treatment. And if you're actually looking at each one of these processes, you can actually understand that there is a tremendous amount of opportunities that we have, and also there are some gaps with the system. But once we actually look at these processes, we can identify those opportunities and also make sure that we can translate that one into something meaningful from the patient and also caregiver's perspective. And that can be measured also at both population as well as the patient level. And we've been talking about basically precision medicine as well, and that is going to be feasible if you really look into the care processes. Next slide. I'm going to be actually sharing some just information on the pre-action part, which is collectively talking about diagnostic pathways as well as actual patient treatment. Next slide. when you're looking at the current diagnostic pathway that we have, it's actually obvious that we actually have a very good and effective way of identifying patients with Alzheimer. But what is not really feasible is that when it comes to some of this information that we have, we understand that it is not actually a very simple process. It's very complex. And also, it requires some actual looking at, for example, imaging that is going to be used for differential actual diagnosis, as well as some of these actual confirmatory confirmation of biomarkers like amyloid or even tau for some of these new and emerging treatments. Next slide. When you're looking at the current and future patient journey, as actually I presented, it's a very complex journey, but it can be used very effectively to identify patients. But what is going to be actually, next slide. Next one, please. Yeah, thank you. And when it comes to actually this process, we can see that blood-based biomarkers for the time being actually is not really used effectively to confirm the amyloid or even tau. But currently, we can actually use that one for the screening of patients. And that is part of the journey already. But this is going to actually change in the future. And some of the things that we thought that this is going to be available maybe within the next 10 years is actually happening much faster than what we anticipated. And even within the next 1 or 2 years, we're going to see actually some of these diagnostic action that is going to be available for us with proper diagnosis of patients. And next slide, please. These are actually different ways that it's going to trigger actual changes, which is basically the accurate diagnosis of patients that is currently available, the new emerging treatments that are going to be available as well, and also staging of patients and biomarker confirmation is going to be part of what we're actually dealing with all these patients going forward. And also, there is going to be a shift in the practice, in the paradigm actual shift that we're going to anticipate by going to the left and identifying these patients much earlier with the presentation of the disease. But what is actually going to be really different as well is that who are the patients that they are going to be eligible for these new treatments. Next slide, please. We've been talking about actual system constraints and the fact that when you're looking at this actually group of patients, the prevalence of the disease is very high. But when you're looking at the patients that are clinically diagnosed is much smaller. And also, Dr. Peterson, just mentioned that if you're looking at some of these exclusion and inclusion criteria, that is going to even further actually increase the number of patients. But that said, the reality is that when you're looking at some of these recent studies that was done, these actual simulation study that was done by RAND, and they looked at some constraint that we have within the system, and it shows clearly that patients are going to be waiting actually for proper diagnosis and also some of these confirmation of biomarkers for more than a year. And that is not going to go away anytime soon because based on actually the number of patients that we have, that is going to be taking almost 4 or 5 years just to basically deal with some of the shortcomings of the system, including diagnostic care action providers as well as biomarker testing. And of course, with actually all these capacity issues that we have, we need to add some educational constraints that we have as well, because that is really needed in terms of how actually prepare basically the healthcare system to deal with all these patients and also deal with some emerging treatments that are going to be available soon. Next slide, please. When we are looking at actually the disease impact, it's very important as well, right? Because Alzheimer is actually something that is dealing with not only the cognitive impairment that we have and functional disabilities, but also is going to have an impairment to quality of life of patients as well as their caregivers. Next one. So early diagnosis actually is very important, and at the same time, it's going to help us reduce not only the care but also prepare for the future. Not only, and also this is going to be very important from patient and caregivers' perspective as well, because they can plan accordingly. And also, it was shown that if 88% of individuals that they develop Alzheimer's disease are diagnosed at the stage of MCI, there would be a tremendous amount of cost saving for the system, actually close to $7 trillion. And that is very important to understand. Next slide, please. And also, if you want to really realize the value of new and emerging treatments in the future, we need to make sure that the early diagnosis is going to happen, because as patients progress over time, the amount of cost that is going to incur within the system is going to be really high. Next one. And also, it was shown that the amount of actual expenditure that we have is going to be really high, especially when you're looking at patients with MCI that they're going to transition to mild AD dementia. Next one. So there's a benefit of actually diagnosing all these patients earlier, and that includes basically coordinated care path as well as ability management for all these patients and symptoms that they have, and also improving the safety of the patients and potential saving for the system from the societal and also from the informal care perspective, and also improving the quality of life of the patients and preserving it actually for a longer time is going to be possible. Next slide. This is actually something that Dr. Peterson just presented, so I'm not going to actually walk you through this one because it's just actually a summary of what we have in Clarity AD for the Lecanemab, but we just wanted to actually present that what actually you see is basically the primary and all-secondary endpoints. Are some actual limitations in terms of inclusion-exclusion criteria. I just wanted to point out that when it comes to Clarity AD, we had a very diverse actual type of clinical study. And we included many patients with comorbidities as well as complications. And one of the things that actually I've heard that, for example, patients with depression, they were excluded from the clinical study. Although that was actually one of the exclusion criteria, we just excluded patients that they were not having a medical condition that was stable. And that is very important again to understand, because even in Clarity AD, approximately 30% of patients that we included in Clarity AD, they were on antidepressants. So that is actually something that I wanted to make sure that we understand it. Next slide, please. In terms of value and clinical meaningfulness, next. Value actually is something that means different things to different people. When it comes to actual provider, what they actually consider as value is going to be related mostly to what actually they prescribe and what is the efficacy and safety of the treatment that they have. But also from the someone that actually a patient, preserving and also improving the quality of life, that would be the most important aspect of treatment for them. So just put actual things in perspective. Next slide, please. I really like this one because we've been talking about clinical meaningfulness, and there was a framework that looked at everything that we have in terms of not only the clinical aspect of it and the cognitive and functional abilities, but also at the bottom, actually, they're talking about the fact that let's look at actually some of the cumulative effect that we have and predictive modeling that you can actually apply to see what type of difference actually we're going to make in the lives of patients that they're being treated with the new treatments. This is actually something that Dr. Wilson just presented, so I'm not going to walk you through this, but even a modest 25% change from baseline, that would be actually very meaningful from every actual single stakeholder that they presented to. Next slide. This is actually the predictive modeling that I've been talking about, and this is an Archimedes condition event simulator, and we use that one to look at the long-term health outcomes of patients that they receive lecanemab. And also we had the opportunity to look at everything actually from cost as well as some of the quality of life and even a measure actually that we use in health technology assessment, which is called quality adjusted life years. So there's a very flexible actual framework that we use to simulate the data over the lifetime of patients that they receive lecanemab. Next slide. Next. As we actually see in this one, when you're actually following patients over time, there is a 2 to 3 year delay in the disease progression when they receive lecanemab over a lifetime. And just for information, although we actually follow these patients over time, just wanted to clarify that the average duration of treatment for the majority of these patients, based on the simulation that we had, it was not actually more than 4 years. The exact it was 3.7, 3.8 years. And that is actually something that we observed, that when you follow these patients over time, that 27% change from baseline can be translated into 3 years of delay in the disease progression for these patients. Next slide, please. We also tested actually some of the things in the actually one. I just wanted to actually share with you that we've run a series of scenario analyses, and we just demonstrated that when you're looking at patients at earlier stages, they can benefit most from treatment. And that is, again, a testament to early diagnosis and the benefit of patients. Next slide. We've been talking about actually the industry role. Next, please. And that is very important because, to me, everything that is related to R&D in terms of discovery and development that we had, that is contributing to the overall impact in this area. But also designing the clinical trial that is going to be meaningful from different actual perspectives and also from different stakeholders is very important. And also we have to deal with the regulatory approval in the US and across the globe, and also manufacturing and quality control for all these products that we actually put out there is going to be very important. Following actual availability of the drug, pharmacovigilance is going to be provided, and also make sure that we are tracking all these patients in terms of safety and tolerability. Also, access is very actually important, and providing these treatments in a timely fashion is going to be meaningful for everyone, including actual patients. And also medical education and awareness is part of actually the role that industry plays, as well as some of the collaborations with researchers and also some academic centers that we've had in the past. For example, actually over the last 2 years, my team has been working very closely with many actually different investigators in the US and across the globe, and also even with the VA system. We've been working over the last 2 years, and we have published at least 20 abstracts and more than 2-3 manuscripts that has been actually submitted for publication and the remote. So those are the things that actually we wanted to do. And also in terms of post-marketing studies, this is not going to be actually what we usually do, just bring the product to the market. We keep actually providing additional evidence and make sure that this is going to be helpful, and also is going to change the way that the clinical practice guidelines are going to be provided in the future. And also patient support programs, including financial support, is part of actually what the industry does in order to help patients and their families. Next slide. And this is actually going to be more meaningful when you look at the drug development for Alzheimer and the number of failures that we had in the past. And even in a recent actual publication as of 1995, they actually mentioned that there has been more than $42 billion that was actually invested in this area. We're not talking about actual expenditure from the pharmaceutical company. This was really an investment. And that is really important because I really do appreciate when people they talk about treatment and the cost of treatment and refer to it as expenditure. It's an investment. This is actually going to help patients and going to help the majority of actual people and the society. And that is very important from everyone's perspective. Next one. Another actual one that it was very important as part of actual industry initiative. We actually have a website that is providing understanding ARIA, that is giving actual a lot of educational material in terms of what actual ARIA is and what type of educational actual material we can provide to healthcare providers, including actual PCPs and also neurologists. And that is something that we wanted to mention that is part of actual what we also do in order to actually provide an impact for patients and their families. Next one. And there's self-guided educational materials on the website that can be actually accessed by everyone, and that is very important. And also there are many videos that is provided as well for the number of people that they're interested in dealing with ARIA, and also these are all available, as I said, as of the time that we receive accelerated approval by FDA. Next one. And as I presented actually today, I just wanted to reiterate that we are actually here to work and collaborate with everyone, and public-private collaboration is a must. We need to work together to make a difference for patients that they're suffering from Alzheimer, and also make sure that we provide the help that they need, and also help their families and the society at large. Thank you so much for your attention.
And I just want to thank you so much for your presentation. I think for our next presenter, they're having a lot of trouble hearing us up from the podium, unfortunately. So I think we may need to have our next presenter maybe sit in.
Right. They can put slides in. One up. Let's see. Yes. No.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
I've been asked to talk
Online. The online. They say okay. Carrie's back. Okay, I hear you better here.
Everyone's going to hear me here. Are you there? You're going to hear me. Okay. So Dr. Gill and I are happy to talk about programs facilitating integration of disease-modifying therapies, DMTs, and diagnostic testing into clinical practice. And we're going to talk about the Mass General Brigham experience. Here are our disclosures. Here's the outline of the talk. Briefly introduce people to the Mass General Brigham healthcare system. We're going to talk about existing dementia health care programs and current Alzheimer's clinical research programs, how they're different. Spend most of the time on bottlenecks, challenges, and opportunities, and how each stakeholder might be able to contribute to solutions. One of the challenges is going to be building a new infrastructure to deliver these treatments within current dementia care programs, and we'll review the MGB's emerging plans. Another challenge is obviously the cost of disease-modifying therapies and all the components needed for determining eligibility, risk assessment, and safety monitoring. In terms of the limitations, there are huge capacity limits of dementia experts who have the knowledge to confirm Alzheimer's diagnosis and staging, guide patients through the treatment decisions, and monitor for safety. There are huge constraints in the time and capacity of primary care and community health providers to identify and diagnose patients appropriately. And there's a huge challenge in terms of disadvantaged and minoritized communities. So Mass General Brigham, Boston-based nonprofit hospital and physician network, includes the Brigham and Women's Hospital, where Seth and I are from, and Mass General Hospital, two major teaching hospitals in the Harvard Medical School. It's the biggest healthcare provider in Massachusetts, caring for about 1.5 million patients annually. we talked to many of our colleagues, and the challenges and things that we're talking about and facing are very similar to ones that are facing other healthcare systems like us. And we're a very well-off system, and the challenges that we face are going to be magnified in less wealthy, well-off systems. So let's talk about dementia care programs at MGB and elsewhere. This is an interdisciplinary care center with disciplines of cognitive neurology, geriatric psychiatry, neuropsychiatry, neuropsychology, social work, cognitive therapy, lots of trainees. In general, patients are referred to our center by PCPs and various medical specialists because concerns are raised about changes in their patients' cognitive, neuropsychiatric, or functional status. The interdisciplinary clinical assessment and evaluation occurs. Most people get imaging, such as an MRI, routine blood work. Some get biomarkers through CSF, usually. Some do specialized testing, like neuropsychological evaluations. Then patients and their care partners are provided with likely diagnoses. Treatment plans are created and implemented either by the dementia care team or via our recommendations to referring clinicians. Symptomatic medical treatments are offered aimed at cognitive impairment, neuropsychiatric symptoms, other medical conditions, sleep disorders, and hypertension and the like. Thank you. And then cognitive therapy, skills training, counseling often provided here. And social work referrals and patient care partner support provided by Alzheimer's Association and similar programs. Now, in terms of clinical research programs at MGB, only a subset of our dementia care providers are actively involved as PIs or site PIs. Only a subset of our patients participate in clinical research, some of which is supported by NIA-funded Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. These programs have very well-established infrastructures. They've developed systems for selecting appropriate patients based on inclusion and exclusion criteria, for delivering disease-modifying therapies, for carefully measuring, recording, monitoring, and managing side effects, measuring and recording the impact on cognitive, neuropsychiatric, and functional status, and collecting data on the impact of biomarkers. They tend to have a large group of coordinators and research assistants that help ensure that patients follow study protocols and come through their surveillance testing follow-ups. So the current clinical dementia care programs are very different. There is no infrastructure staffing levels that are found in Alzheimer's clinical research programs. These systems and infrastructure need to be built within the clinical dementia care programs. This is a cartoon that gives a sense of numbers involved. A large number of patients come from primary care and community health centers. Funneled in, a small group of them are sent to the clinical dementia care programs. Some get back into the primary care, they go back to primary care for the actual treatment. The Alzheimer's clinical research program intersects with the clinical dementia care program involving a subset of patients. We have tried to estimate how many patients we're talking about. And we think that right now, based on who's in our various dementia care centers, that we have about 400 mildly impaired patients who would currently meet criteria. We think that approximately 600 patients a year have mild AD that are evaluated and will need to be dealt with. This is the hardest number. We think that there may be a few thousand people in the system at large who would meet all appropriate criteria. However, epidemiological research would suggest that there could be up to 20,000 at least that we have to consider. They will be funneled into a process where appropriate patients are selected and treatment safety ensured. And then there'll be all this disease-modifying clinical activity that will grow in time. We'll be talking about the bottlenecks, which are on both ends, but let's start with the challenge in the middle of identifying appropriate patients and ensuring safe treatment. The Mass General Alzheimer's Therapeutic Program, commonly known as ATP, goal is to ensure expedited and safe implementation of novel treatments for Alzheimer's patients. It's system-wide, as we're envisioning it, with a centralized program that I'll tell you about, but multiple hospitals will be contributing in different ways. This will be specialized therapeutic MGB clinic, created specifically to identify, evaluate, treat, and monitor patients who are receiving these therapies. It's somewhat analogous to anticoagulation management services that have traditionally existed to deal with things like warfarin. The oversight of these clinics will be managed by ATP providers, these dementia experts, on a weekly rotation, and patient care will therefore be shared responsibility of the ATP clinic and not individual clinicians. We envision consensus conferences to adjudicate therapy for complex cases, somewhat analogous to a tumor board. Providers who are not affiliated with this specialty clinic will not be treating or prescribing the meds or monitoring. However, the patient will be maintaining his or her relationship with a specialist outside of the program for ongoing care. Treatment and monitoring linked to these drugs will take place in the clinic, at least until there's a broader experience with prescribing and monitoring. We will be participating in AlzNet, which is a multi-site network for the collection of real-world data from patients receiving novel FDA-approved AD therapies in the United States. This is organized by the Alzheimer's Association. So we'll be collecting baseline and longitudinal patient data on cognition, neuropsychiatric status, and function and safety. We'll be collecting and archiving imaging, genetic data, and fluid biomarkers, and tracking outcomes. It's a big process. The framework will include developing evidence-based diagnostic and selection criteria, evidence-based therapies for monitoring in the form of protocols, creation of electronic medical record order sets. We need to figure out how we're going to manage referrals from EMGB dementia centers, from the Department of Neurology, and from the wider healthcare system. We need to sort out how amyloid status is going to be determined. Currently, it's by CSF, spinal fluid, or very rarely amyloid PET, and we await blood biomarkers. We have to figure out how to implement the infusion center treatments. There's a huge task of communicating and educating and training patients and caregivers and clinicians, especially neurologists, psychiatrists, and radiologists, as well as infusion center staff. This is going to be rolled out within a specialty clinic staffed by our dementia experts until we've sorted things out and then may expand. So to summarize, these are the stakeholders. Here are long-term and near-term possibilities. For the healthcare systems, as I've been talking about, we need to develop and implement programs that can deliver disease-modifying therapies and carefully monitor patient safety. We need to train advanced practice providers and other personnel because there's a huge gap due to the limited number of physicians with dementia expertise. Over a longer term, we need to develop more efficient, patient-friendly programs. We need to train a wider range of providers, both primary and specialty, and how to deliver high-quality, safe care. In terms of federal agencies, what's going to be critical to us is approval and reimbursement for the appropriate use of these medications and all the relevant services, fusions, MRIs, clinical visits needed for patient safety. Our hospital, it's very similar to what Randy said, it's not going to approve of the medications if there isn't access to people beyond those who can afford to pay by themselves. In the future, we're hoping for support for reimbursement for Alzheimer evaluation time and disease-modifying safety and monitoring activities that don't necessarily involve direct face-to-face patient care, and to set guidelines and review medical, diagnostic, and devices like digital phenotyping and data mining. In terms of what our pharmaceutical industry colleagues can help us with, is to help defray the cost of training existing pertinent specialists, dementia specialists, neuroradiology, and the like. and over a longer term, support for educational programs for patients, caregivers, and clinicians, and collaboration with the healthcare system and federal agencies to sponsor these real-world pragmatic research to study EMP implementation science using electronic health records and databases. This is the next bottleneck, and I will turn to my colleague.
All right. Hi, I have a couple of minutes. I'm Dr. Gill from Brigham and Women's. So talking about this bottleneck that Dr. Daffner described, this is when you identify the patients who are mildly impaired, and then you have new patients every year. You end up with a large amount of people who are identified, some of which are eligible, some of which are. So this has been discussed throughout the day actually today, but there's a challenge with diagnosis in general. You know, in the US, most people with dementia are not recognized, they're not diagnosed, they're not identified. And for people with mild impairment, it's even higher. The numbers, some of the studies showed 90, 95%, let's say, of people with mild impairment are not recognized. Some people may know that some mild cognitive impairment is due to Alzheimer's, some is not, some has a number of concomitant contributions, so that's a challenge. For every patient that's currently identified as care, there's 5 to 6 times as many who have not yet been diagnosed. One of the first points of the health system, this first line evaluation that happened, this is where the crux is, where you have primary care and community health center presentations of cognitive impairment. Oftentimes when people get diagnosed at that stage, it's too late. And also the codes that are used and the diagnoses that are made because of the expertise shortage are not precise enough to make an evaluation. So in other words, to make an evaluation for eligibility for disease-modifying therapy, so you're left with not well characterized patients with good intentioned clinicians, but without a way to bridge that into the program that we were discussing. So just to highlight that, you have the spectrum of Alzheimer's disease-related dementias, and right, these disease-modifying therapies in the near term are looking for people in the MCI and mild dementia stage. So just to summarize that in 2 steps, you need to first identify patients, and then you have to confirm their diagnosis. And that's not trivial, as people may know. So the way that, as Dr. Daffner said, the way that people come to attention is that they're either directly referred in a health system to specialists with some characterization of what's going on. Maybe it'll say cognitive impairment or dementia. And you could also search electronic health records using the way we do in epidemiology to identify diagnostic codes. But oftentimes, those codes are not universally or used in a standardized way, and they often never involve staging. So you might have a diagnosis of dementia, for example, without the staging. So that's step 1, just identifying. Step 2, as people have alluded to all day, is that there's additional tests and expertise that is needed to confirm diagnosis, and in addition to which includes Alzheimer's disease biomarkers, genetic status. There's a genetic profile that enables full discussions with patients and families about the risks of these new DMTs. And all of that requires expertise of Alzheimer's disease experts. So you have step 1, accurate identification, diagnosis, big hurdle. Step 2, confirmation of diagnosis, testing. So there are opportunities there together. So our thoughts are for health systems. So additional disease training already in progress about dementia for primary care, and not just dementia, but specifically for disease modifying therapy programs. That's all new for everyone. In Massachusetts, for example, there is a requirement now for all providers in your renewal of your license to have some modicum level of Alzheimer's disease care and knowledge. It's not actually catered yet to DMTs because it's all new, but that could be a model across the country. There's new systems, and we need in the long term new systems to educate all the personnel that are going to carry out these programs. For federal agencies, as Dr. Daffner talked about, support for cost coverage and evaluation of all the tools that we need to do this, right? Which is the medications themselves, genetic status testing, biomarkers, and whatever validated screening tools can be used over a population. In the longer term, I think payment for leveraging the expertise of dementia experts to first-line evaluators is really important. Consideration for actually reimbursing this non-face-to-face care. So what happens in our health system is this happens all the time, every day, informally now, where people providers who are first seeing complaints from patients and families of cognitive impairment kind of overload the very small amount of experts with well-intentioned questions about what to do next. So we need to solve that problem by compensating and educating to improve that gap of knowledge, basically. And then for our industry colleagues, there's already efforts with getting health systems ready with readiness for DMT in the form of conversations and discussions like this, but funding current validated models or figuring out how to do that of Alzheimer's disease screening that already exists and scaling that across the system is one thing to consider in the short term. In the long term, ongoing development of screening tools and techniques. I'm wary of time, and I know that we're up against break. So, second challenge. When you identify all these new patients and you confirm their diagnosis, most are not going to be eligible for disease-modifying therapies, as has been discussed. And we have to make sure to pay attention to how to do longitudinal care for patients that we now identify in the large numbers. And there's a significant capacity limitation, as has been described, of that expertise and all the care and services that are needed to have those people in the system now. So you have newly identified dementia patients, you're putting them through a funnel of a very limited capacity. Some of them are getting new disease-modifying therapies, but most just need care. So this has been discussed too today. And I think it's just notable in this context that most dementia care in the United States for decades has been done in primary care and family practice and community health. It's actually not done in specialty care. Specialty care does the best they can, but there's just limited providers. Wait times are huge, as people know. So what you have now is some change of that, with the promise of expanding capacity and personnel, but it's never going to meet the numbers of newly diagnosed dementia patients. So this ongoing relationship with primary care and community health is essential. There's no way that, in the immediate term that specialists can handle these patients. So let me highlight. So one thing to highlight is that there has been some limited training supported by federal agencies in fellowship programs for specialists, but not as much in our particular subfield of neuropsychiatry and cognitive neurology. So that's one thing to consider, that we could discuss collaboration related to getting more experts trained over the next X amount of years. What else to highlight? And I hope that people will also reference these slides, and hopefully we can discuss some of these things in the conversation that is after this. And just in general for industry sponsors, there are charitable foundations that pharmaceutical industries and other biotech companies have. And those could be pooled in some way, at least our idea is to make charitable contributions so that these goals are being met to actually meet those care needs. Okay, so finally, equitable access to diagnostic tools and treatment. So not only along lines of race and ethnicity, along lines of financial insecurity and all the other social terms of health we've been talking about. So just to highlight a couple of facts here. So Black and Hispanic Americans are 1.5 to 2 times more likely to suffer from dementia of all cause, but are much less likely to be diagnosed and treated. Almost more than 65% less diagnosed and treated than their counterparts. If we take a look at these populations over the history of our, as of yet, not too effective Alzheimer's treatments, there is less treatment, less prescribing that happens, poorer treatment adherence to this population, a higher discontinuation of the intervention. So if you take these populations into new disease-modifying therapies without a lot of sensitivity to making that different, then I think you're gonna have the same disparities that have happened to date. I'm shortcutting here, but hopefully people understand what I've just threaded there. One other fact is that of surveyed Black, Hispanic, Native, and Asian American individuals who have Alzheimer's or cognitive impairment, the vast majority felt it was important for providers to understand the racial and ethnic background and experiences, and up to 40% felt they have not been listened to because of their race ethnicity. So that's a really profound point that we have to have sensitivity into as we design these programs. So to highlight, in the near term, something we're doing is deliberately understanding in our health system which centers and clinics serve racial and ethnic minority populations in order to ensure that new diagnostic screening techniques and implementing DMTs are done as successfully in other places. And that takes looking at the barriers that are happening there versus maybe in other clinics. Let's see. For federal agencies, consideration of linking, this has been talked about today too, existing programs that are funded to the new DMT initiatives. And one last point here in our industry colleagues, that to kind of mimic what's happening in publicly funded studies to ensure that clinical trials that look at DMTs and devices and diagnostics have representative samples of all racial and ethnic populations, right? This is discussed. There's discussions about requiring quotas and populations that represent the American population, but this isn't always followed. There's been a lot of progress with this recently, as was highlighted by our industry colleagues today, actually. Okay, so to conclude, so these are the many challenges and opportunities facing health systems that try to integrate wide-scale, accurate disease identification and diagnostic testing with safe and effective delivery of DMTs. Challenge of limited expertise in identifying and staging Alzheimer's disease. And we all have inexperience with DMTs. So this is the thing. So it's new for experts. It's new for everyone, as people know. And we can reduce this with targeted public and private funding for the training of primary care and specialty providers. Again, that's one point to highlight, but this training and this leveraging of expertise is just a critical point that we need to address.
Sure. It's imperative to study DMT delivery programs like ATP at Mass General Brigham, with a focus on implementation and health services delivery to ensure equitable and safe access to all. Both, thank you, near and long-term solutions to these challenges and bottlenecks for DMT care will require close collaboration across all public and private stakeholders. So, thank you.
So, thank you both for presenting that. Exactly what we hear. I think we have time for a break. We do. All right. So we're going to give everybody exactly 9.5 minutes. Water and bio break, and we'll see you back here. We're going to start with the discussion for your turn.
Produced by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.